All right, it's no secret. I love expensive tools, but in this video, I'm shoving them all to the side and I'm going to show you how to build 2 high-quality custom pieces of furniture with basic woodworking tools you probably already have. And I'm going to attempt to do it in just 48 hours. You heard correctly, not 1, but 2 walnut pedestal tables in 48 hours. It is now 1 o'clock on Tuesday. Probably should have started a little earlier. Now there's no Hollywood tricks here, no smoke and mirrors. I have never built this piece, so I'm starting from scratch, but with a set of plans. Now this pedestal table was designed by my buddy Joe Teal at Boundary Fog Furniture, and I thought it would be fun to take me out of my comfort zone and use minimal tools, and because I generally build on the slower side, assign myself a time limit and really make it interesting. Now all 4 of these pieces are from the same slab, I remember, so color variation shouldn't be an issue. I have a splinter already. Ooh, that's a good one. Now, since I'm starting with rough lumber, I begin at the jointer to get one face flat before running it through the planer. Now, if you don't have a jointer and you're starting with rough lumber, then you probably already have a method for milling rough stock with a table saw and a planer sled. Or, if you're able to source S4S material, well, then you're already way ahead of the game. Now, a quick little tip here, if you're too busy to apply wax to your cast iron surfaces, like me, or too lazy, like me, a quick rub down with some wax paper will do the trick. And don't cheap out on the store brand, get the real deal, the Reynolds. It's going to have the most wax content. And no, I have no data to back that up. Maybe Suman has a video on that.
What? Me? I have no data on that, but these cookies come right off.
Now, as you all probably know by now, I like nice, straight grain like this. These cathedrals, not my favorite. So what I'm going to do is cut out the majority of the flat sawn areas on these pieces and then glue these back together for my top. Here's a quick explanation from my last video on rift sawn. Because it's cut at roughly a 45-degree angle, it gives perfectly straight grain on all 4 sides. Now we are also going to incorporate that method into our center pedestal section because I do not want this wild cathedral flat sawn grain going up the center post on my table. Now I need 3 pieces like this for each center pedestal section, so I need 6 total. Now I'm obviously eliminating a lot of material when I cut out that flat sawn center section, so I need to be mindful that I'm going to have enough width with all my pieces to glue up my tops. And for my center post pieces, I'm going for a rough width of about 3 inches, because as you'll see shortly, we need to put a double 30-degree bevel on each side of these pieces. Okay, these are the 3-inch strips cut for our center pedestal. Now, each one of these needs a 30-degree bevel on each side parallel to each other, but we really need to pay attention to the grain. For example, on this one, if I cut a 30-degree bevel here and here, I'm going to end up with flat sawn grain showing on the edges. But if we flip it this way and cut our 30-degree bevels this way, you can see we have straight grain going towards the outer cut on each of them. Now, on this quarter sawn piece, it's not an issue. We could do it either way, and we'll have nice straight grain on the sides. But before we cut the bevels on these pieces, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, Temu. Now, if you haven't heard of Temu, it's an online marketplace with a million things you need and another million things you didn't even know you needed. But your best bet is to download the Temu app on your smartphone using the link in the description below for more perks and a smoother shopping experience. And in the app, search for my code, DKM5353, and new users can claim a $100 coupon bundle. So I set out to see if I could find things that will be useful here in the shop. And, out of special consideration, what Jerry and Lola might like. But first, how about this telescoping magnet for when you drop your arbor nut down into your table saw when you're changing your blade? Works every time. Or if you can't reach your dust collector remote that's way over there. And how about some more magnets? These little screw-on magnetic discs are the perfect solution for keeping all of my planes securely in place in my plane till. And have you ever hand-cut dovetails using green tape? Well, X-Acto knives are surgically sharp and the perfect tool for crisp layout. Check out this little set. Now, cords and hoses are the bane of my existence in the shop, and these little Velcro hook straps make quick work of wrangling extension cords like this so I can hang them and get them out of the way. Speaking of cords, every cord needs power, and these little power strips not only have plenty of power plugs, but also USB-C and USB-A ports. And I thought this would work nicely as a tool pouch, but I was informed by my wife that it's actually a handbag or MERS, male purse. And what about a nice little box of assorted washers, or this rechargeable LED flashlight, and the always useful zip ties, multicolored? And since Shopcat Lola and Jerry also need to stay organized and comfortable, these comfy cat beds make the perfect nap spot or sulking spot. So be sure to download the Temu app on your smartphone for the best shopping experience and search for my code DKM5353 to access a $100 coupon bundle. Thanks again to Temu for sponsoring this video. Now, in order to cut these at exactly 30 degrees, we really can't rely on the gauge on our table saw. Now, I actually have this 30-degree setup bar, which I can push this right up to the blade. Now, the other method, which I think most people have one of these, a digital angle gauge. I hate these things. All right, with that set to 0, and there you go. It's on 60, aka 30. Now, my big concern here was any internal tension in these boards. Since I need that 30-degree bevel on both sides, if I encountered any tension on that first cut and the board came out like a banana, I would be in trouble to make the second cut and I would have to grab different material. The feather board helps keep things flush and tight against the fence, and I was fortunate with these cuts that they came out pretty clean. Because we've created a sharp edge here, that could and does go under the table saw fence just a little bit. So I'm going to actually make this cut 2 and a hair bigger to account for that. I'm going to use the tooth of my blade to line up with my mark, and then I'm going to move it over just a hair. So I just want to show you, this is the result of just taking a little extra time with your layout. Straight grain on all 4 sides, on all pieces. Now I could start rough cutting my material to length for my tops and getting them prepped for glue up. I want to get these in the clamps as quickly as possible. Now, the plans call for the top to be 20 inches in diameter. Unfortunately, the slab material I had that had the really cool crotch figure in it, I had mistakenly cut too short, and the max I would be able to get out of it was 19 inches. I'll realize later that proportionally, making that top smaller was a bit of a bummer. All right, so at this point we have the pieces for our tops ready for glue up, and then we have our center pedestal pieces milled up and ready for glue up. Now, Joe gave me the tip on gluing these up of using hose clamps. Because this is going to be an irregular shape, which in case you haven't quite put that together in your head yet, is going to look like that. Now, since I only have enough here to glue up one at a time, put this in the clamps and then focus on the tops, and then come back, pull these off, and glue up the other one. Start in the middle and work our way out on each side. That way the glue goes out towards the ends. It's a mess, but I have squeeze out along every joint. So while that was being squeezed, I could turn my attention to the tops and laying out all my pieces for the most pleasing grain. Rather than glue this up in one giant piece, which then I cannot mill it at all unless I do it by hand because I don't have a planer wide enough. Same for this. I'm going to glue this up in one section, this in one section, and this in one section. Leave that in the clamps for a few hours. Then later this evening, take them out, mill it down to final thickness on all of these, and then do one final glue up and let that sit in the clamps overnight. Now, my reasoning for doing this is if I glued up the whole thing as one and I ended up with a slightly cupped panel for whatever reason, then I'm kind of stuck. But this way, with 2 panels flattened and then glued up, I have a much better chance of them staying flat. All right, while those are in the clamps, Lola suggested we work on the circle jig for the router. So the first thing I did was rip down a piece of plywood to the same width as the base plate of my router, and then mark the location for some mounting holes that correspond with the base plate of my router, which as you can see aren't centered. I mean, why would they be? And of course the mounting screws were too long, so I had to add on an auxiliary base plate. Then I could plunge down through that sub base to get the exact location of my router bit. This will allow me to lay out for the radius of my tops. I'm going to draw a line here, which is the outside edge of the bit. 9 1/4. Now that is going to be the center of my pin. Now what I want to do is create a piece that will fit in the center of our post here and will act as a registration pin for when we drop the top on. So I want whatever diameter that is to be the same diameter, hello Jerry, as the pin that we use here. This is a 1/2 inch drill bit. That will work nicely. So I need a 1/2 inch wooden dowel. I guess I'll have to make one. And so I did. I took a scrap piece of walnut that was about 9/16 square, shaved the end, and then just started pounding it through the dowel plate. This is made by DFM Toolworks. He has imperial and metric. There's a link below. Super handy when you need to make your own dowels. And then I could drill out the corresponding 1/2 inch hole in the router jig. All right, I also drilled out the hole where our bit will come down with that 1/2 inch bit, because I've learned in the past if you leave that as a 1/4 the same size as the bit, there's really no way for those chips to get out and you end up with burning like we had when we first plunged that through our base. All right, enough fun with routers and bases for right now. Let's get this center pedestal out of the clamps so we can get the other one in there. Ah, my glove! Relax, it's just a glove. Boop. We doing good on time? And with the clock ticking on day 1, I could get my first set of panels out of the clamps and then run them through the planer down to the final thickness of 1 inch, and then go back to the clamps, glue those up, tighten them down. But I did have one thing left to do before I could put them aside and let them rest overnight, and that was to grab my
Total boat, baby.
thickened epoxy. That way I could fill the voids on the bottom without having it running all over the place, and then flip it over because I did have a few knots and holes to fill on the top side. And with a little wax taper to prevent it from sticking to my tape, I secured everything down and mushed it in, then flipped it over and filled those other little voids on the top. All right, Jerry, we need to figure out our upper and lower supports. Now for the upper supports, the material needs to be 1 inch thick, but for the lower supports, they need to be 1.5 inches, which is why the plans call for 8/4 stock, because you need to get down to that 1.5 inches. Or you can use all 5/4 material and then glue up for those lower supports. The most important thing to keep in mind is that your upper supports are all the same thickness and your lower supports are all the same thickness. So run them all through the planer at the exact same time. If the uppers are 0.98 inches, it's fine. Just make sure they're all 0.98 inches. It is 10:30. These two are ready for bed. So let me flip you around and show you what I got done. Now I have my pieces roughed out for my lower supports. It'll be 2 out of this one, 2 out of that one, 1 each out of that, 2 for the upper support, so the 6 total. The 2 tops are in the clamps. That's epoxy covered so Jerry doesn't step in it. The 2 center pedestals are glued up, so those we can plane tomorrow. And let's see where we're at. Just under 10 hours for the first day. Hey, good morning, Lola. I thought you were going to finish this last night. All right, I gotta say, I felt like I was in a good position after what I got accomplished in day 1. Unfortunately, what I got done was the easy stuff. So obviously some indentations there, but joints are nice and tight. All right, just gonna mark all these faces so we know what we have done. So I'll run these through the planer with very light passes on all sides, making sure that I take off an even amount. That way I don't open up any joints and lose those crisp bevels. Unfortunately, I ran into some issues. You can see like a 1/16 of an inch that this side was planed down too much, so this edge is now showing through. Now, not really a big deal, but I think why that probably happened is that when this was clamped up, these pieces got tweaked just a little bit, meaning that this face wasn't perfectly parallel to this face when I ran it through the planer, so it was off just a little bit. Now, since the upper and lower supports are different thicknesses, I'm going to be using different sized dovetail bits. The upper will be a 17/32 diameter with a 7-degree angle, and we are going for a 5/8 of an inch depth. First thing to do is grab a piece of scrap and test our depth and our cut. I did have to make one minor adjustment to the depth, but other than that, nice and clean. Then with some careful layout, I could find the center of all of the large faces of the center pedestal where the female part of the sliding dovetail will go. Now, I did have to fiddle with the fence a little to get the exact center of my stock. I just couldn't find a way to get it perfect without some trial and error. And a very important tip here, let that bit come to a complete stop before you pull it back. Any movement at all could come back to bite you later with a loose fitting joint. Now, if only I followed my own advice. And now for the lower supports, we move on to a 3/4 inch diameter dovetail bit, and we'll set that to a 3/4 of an inch depth. Now, I had a real jammer of a time getting this one centered. I kept rotating this thing, moving the fence, getting it centered, rotating the fence, lunging just a little bit, backing it out, till I finally found something I was happy with. Now, I was able to do this in one pass without using a straight bit first to clear out some of that material, but I gotta say that bit wasn't completely happy with that decision. All right, decided to make template for each of these supports, right? That was your idea. All right, so I've roughed out on a scrap piece the cuts that need to be made here. So we're essentially going to be removing all that material and all that material to create a male dovetail. So what I have here, my thought anyway, is a couple pieces of plywood. This will ride along the fence. This will be my backer, so I don't get any tear out. This will ride along here. I'll put a hold down or a toggle clamp here, so this can't move, and this will ride along the fence like this, making that cut. We'll flip it around and make the opposing cut so it's perfectly centered. So one of the biggest things we want to make sure is that this piece right here is perfectly perpendicular to our table. If it's angled at all, then we're going to get a funky dovetail at an angle. Now, this is nothing fancy here, and CA glue makes this assembly go really fast. So once I glue on that front fence, I'll also glue on a fence on the back to ride along my router table fence. And then I attach this little runner. That way the fence stays locked in that T-track slot on the top of my router fence. Then I can glue on an auxiliary block. Then I could screw in a hold down clamp and give this thing a test run. Seems pretty smooth. Now for the real thing. Now, I wasn't aiming for a perfect fit the first time around. I intentionally made it a little oversized just to test the jig and test the cut quality. Everything looked good, so I moved the fence a little bit, made a pass on both sides, and then tested the fit. That fits pretty good. It's tight, but slides in relatively easily. Now we can use the same setup for the other 5 upper supports. Another thing to be mindful of is a lot of chips and everything build up here. So when you put this back down and clamp it, make sure there's nothing underneath here, because that will elevate this piece and cause you to have an uneven shoulder. Now, remember when we were creating the female part of this dovetail in the center post, I said make sure the bit comes to a complete stop before backing out, otherwise it could cause a loose fit later. Well, the same goes for this part of the dovetail. So try to control your variables as much as possible, because I'm not here to sell you a bill of goods. A sliding dovetail is one finicky son of a bitch. All right, I set up the 3/4 inch bit and did this one the same way. The problem is that bit was working hard and all the chips were getting caught in there. So I set up a dado stack on the table saw to remove the majority of that waste and then headed back to the router table. And what an incredible difference that made. The cutting was much cleaner and much smoother, and I didn't have a bunch of dust and chips clogging everything up and potentially sacrificing the quality of that cut. It was a delight. And then all the dovetail joinery was done for our upper supports and lower supports. Here was my little template. I had the dovetail on there, which is 5/8 of an inch, and this is a 16-degree cut. I'm going to take each piece against the stop block and make that cut on all 6 of my upper supports. And for the lower supports, I just set up a new stop block and made a similar cut. Now this angle was only 13 degrees, not 16 like the upper supports. Now the upper and lower supports both need a taper. However, the lower support needs a double taper. So I'm going to mark those out, and then using a tapering jig on my table saw, I'll make those cuts. Now, a tapering jig is a pretty easy thing to make. There's a ton of videos on YouTube on how to make your own, but if you don't want to make your own, you could make these cuts on the bandsaw and then clean up with a hand plane, but a tapering jig will give you the fastest and most consistent results, in my opinion. And there's the double taper on the lower support, and you can see on the left-hand side that gives the table a little foot to sit on the floor. Then I just reset the jig for the upper supports, made all my cuts, and dramatically threw it at the camera. Oh, so much work for so few pieces. Now comes all the handwork. I mean, ideally, these need to be glued into that center pedestal tonight. All right, so I laid out the material I need to remove. First thing we want to do is score our cut line. To do this, I like to just take my utility knife, put it up against there, move my square till it touches it, light passes. Now I'm just going to take a chisel and create a little cavity for the saw blade to go. Now when cutting anything by hand, it's always easier to not cut at an angle, but to cut perpendicular. So I'm actually just going to take my square here, square in the vise. Now we also want to make sure we don't dig into this nice clean shoulder here. Come down to our layout line. Now we can flip this vertical. Now I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to make sure my piece perfect straight up and down in the vise. Now with this cut, it's important, again, not to come down and hit this shoulder, otherwise you'll see the teeth marks on the outside. When I get down close enough, break it off. We'll clean that up with a chisel. And now to round off the bottom of those tenons using a chisel and some sandpaper. All right, I don't know how this happened because we test fit them all, but it's loose. So what I did is I cut a very thin piece of veneer, glued it on, and now it's tight. I don't want to put that in there because it won't come out. It happens. And speaking of happening, all right, we have 14 hours and 20 minutes left, which sounds like plenty of time, but I need to sleep in there. It's 10:30. Lola, she's crashed. Jerry's hanging on barely. I need to sand all these parts, break all the edges, then work on the tops. I need to just stop procrastinating about doing the sanding because it's really not that much. See, there he goes. I know, buddy. Nobody wants to see that. At least I hope they don't. All right, with Jerry's bits put away, it was time to do all the sanding. I did 120, 150, broke all the edges, and then it was time to glue in the upper and lower supports. I decided to use epoxy for the big boys, the lower supports, just to give me a little more open time for assembly and clamping. Now I did do a dry run on clamping these up, but I only clamped 2 legs on, not the third, so I didn't realize that getting that third clamp on was going to be a bit more of a challenge. So I used some tape and CA glue to clamp on a clamping block, which was a cutoff from the miter saw on this leg, and then I got out the big boy, which will eventually yield its own problems, despite my giddiness at the time. Now when I got to the other leg, I got smart and glued on clamping blocks on all 3 legs ahead of time, giving me nice square clamping pressure. Unfortunately, those clamps were a little heavy and it was causing some balancing issues, so I put it in the vise and then got out the big boy to finish that last one. And I have 12 hours and 24 minutes left. Jerry? Lola? These guys are troopers. All right, back at it. Good morning, Lola. 4 hours and 35 minutes remaining. Oh! A great way to start the final day. So apparently the weight of this clamp on this glue up fell, peeled this off. We got a little gap. Yeah, right there. It's slight, dang, but it's there. Okay, one of the last things to do was to drill the 2-stepped hole for the mounting bolts for the upper support. I got a lovely bunch of coconuts. There they are, standing in a row. Then I could finally get these upper supports glued in. Now, if you remember, these are the ones that I glued on a little piece of veneer because it was too loose. Well, these were nice and tight, like mallet whacking tight. So if you recall, I mentioned before that these pieces were unevenly planed, creating the center of this not being centered, which means we couldn't use the pin in here because it's not centered. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to still use this pin. I'm going to glue it in there. I'm going to find my new center, and then I'm going to drill a 5mm hole, and then we can use that same 5mm pin that we used to cut the tops, pop in there, and register it on top.
Now, you don't have to do any of this pin registration. Joe just gave me the tip that it's much easier to make sure that the top is centered perfectly on your base, and you can mark out for your threaded inserts this way. And he's right, way more accurate, way easier. And with those holes drilled, we could use our router jig and that 5mm pin to cut a perfect circle in both of our tops. Now I'm only going down about 1/4 of an inch here using a 1/4 inch bit. Now I'll remove the majority of the waste on the bandsaw and then head to the router table with a flush trim bit. But for your bandsaw, you could do the whole thing there. Or you could just make multiple passes around and around using the router jig until you get all the way through. It's all preference or what tools you have available. Now this monster compression bit by Bits and Bits makes quick work of flush trimming both of these tops.
Okay, now to do the under bevel, this is a 15-degree beveling bit. Now what the plans show and what Joe has always done is a bevel that goes from the bottom edge right to the top edge. The problem is the cutting length on this bit is only 15/16 of an inch. Our stock is 1 inch thick, and the bearing needs something to ride on. So you could make a template, ride the bearing on the template, and cut as far down as it will go, then finish up with a spoke shave or by hand. I just did this test cut, and I actually prefer a little fillet there all the way around, about 3/16 of an inch. Now just remember, the top is up on this cut.
Now I bit off the majority of the material on the first pass, then raised the bit up and made my final clearing pass to get any burning and get to the final bevel height that I wanted.
So here's what's left. Obviously sand the tops, clean up any glue squeeze out on the bases, get those final sanded, threaded inserts in the top to attach the base, and then apply finish. To say it's going to be tight would be an understatement, but we're gonna see how far we get.
Now this is just a 5mm shelf pin that I'm using as my alignment pin. Can drop my base on there.
Now just using the same drill bit that we used to drill that center hole for the threaded inserts.
Now I'm using 3/8 16 threaded inserts because I didn't have any 1/4 20s, and then following up each hole with a countersink bit so that threaded insert sits nice and flush.
Now the biggest tip I can give you when installing threaded inserts to get them in straight is to use a T-handle Allen wrench. Using the one that comes with it at an angle, it's impossible to keep it straight. This is much easier and gives you all directions, and you can look straight down. I have 2 tables, but they need final sanding and finish.
Oh man, I was trying not to look at the timer, but I could feel the walls closing in on me. And then...
Oh, dang. I'm gonna reset the timer and see how long it takes me to finish, and then we'll add it all up. All right, for the finish, Rubio Monocoat Castle Brown.
So using a white Scotch-Brite pad, I just work in all that finish into every angle, crevasse, facet, nook, and cranny. I'll let that sit for 5 or 10 minutes and apply any finish to those areas where it's soaked in more than others. And then I can wipe off all the excess with a microfiber cloth.
Relax.
And then I could move on to the tops, giving them the same treatment. Rub it in, let it sit, and wipe it off. Now I did end up putting a second coat on these tops just to bring up the sheen a little bit.
The only thing left to do is attach the tops with the threaded inserts and the bolts when this is dry. I also need to put in my logo medallions somewhere. But most notably, we are at 1 hour and 55 minutes of extra time.
So with the deadline passed and me dehydrated from shedding so many tears, I could wrap these tables up. First up with my logo medallions by Medallion Maker Branding. Man, I love these things. They really elevate the look and class of your furniture. There's a link in the description below if you want to look into getting some of them for yourself. And then how could we forget actually installing the tops? So using my registration pin and then installing the bolts into the threaded inserts. I guess Lola's taking her seat in the stands to watch the final flip and reveal of these tables. Too bad she paid for the obstructed view seats. Now this is actually the first time I have seen them all together and finished and realized they're a little top heavy.
All right, so I didn't make the deadline, but I'm not calling this a failure. I mean, I have 2 really nice pieces of furniture that I'm very proud of that I finished in 48 hours. Now, I did a couple things differently on this build. First of all, I wasn't really on social media much. It's amazing how productive you can be. I also cleaned up as I went, and it just kept my head in a better space, being more organized. Now, getting back to the time thing, if you've ever filmed anything, you know how much longer things take when you're filming. Not to mention talking to the camera, doing multiple takes, dealing with these guys. So I have no doubt that if I turned the camera off and built these, I could have done it. But that wasn't really the challenge, right? I had to film it. And now Jerry has a new perch, 2 new perches. And don't forget, if you want to build 1 or 2 of these tables for yourself, there's a link in the description below to buy the set of plans. This was originally designed by my buddy Joe Teal at Boundary Fog Furniture. I played with the proportions a little bit and I was wrong. So the plans have been readjusted to match his original intention with a 20-inch top. These supports are a little bit smaller. These are a little bit smaller so that everything is in proportion. So give it a shot. We'll see you on the next one.